The night the storm raged over the Manhattan skyline, Alexander Reed felt as though the world itself was cracking under pressure. Lightning forked across the glass walls of his penthouse, illuminating the shadows inside, where silence pressed heavier than the thunder outside. He stood by the window, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand, watching the rain blur the city into streaks of white and gold. To the world, Alexander was untouchable, a billionaire CEO, a man who carved empires out of ambition and steel. But to himself, in that moment, he was nothing more than a man who had already crossed a line he could not step back from. Behind him, the echoes of a faint melody carried through the penthouse. Isabella's voice, soft and hushed, floated from the nursery they had prepared for the unborn child that was not hers. She hummed in Italian, a lullaby Alexander could not understand but felt deep in his bones. It was as though the sound carried an old sorrow, something ancient and unresolved. It gripped him in ways Olivia's words never did anymore. Olivia, his wife, the woman who carried his child, was asleep in the master bedroom, exhausted from months of pregnancy. She had become fragile, a porcelain figure who spent her days resting and her nights dreaming of the baby to come. Alexander loved her, or at least he told himself he once did, but lately he felt suffocated. Their marriage, once electric, now felt like a contract of duty. Olivia was perfect in the eyes of society, the wife who smiled at galas, who charmed board members, who gave speeches about philanthropy and family legacy. But behind closed doors, Alexander saw only distance. And then there was Isabella. The first time she entered their lives, she seemed unremarkable, hired through an agency, a live-in nanny meant to help when the baby arrived. She was polite, careful, and understated, wearing modest dresses and keeping her dark hair neatly tied back. But there was something in her eyes, a mystery wrapped in warmth, that unsettled him. She carried herself with a poise that didn't belong to a servant. Every movement, every word, was precise, as though she had been trained to command and conceal at once. Alexander didn't notice at first how often he lingered in the rooms where she was. How his ears sought the sound of her voice, how his eyes caught the curve of her profile when she bent over a book or folded laundry. Olivia trusted her completely, never once suspecting that her husband's glances lasted too long, or that the silence between him and Isabella was heavy with unspoken things. One evening, as the city glimmered beneath a crimson sunset, Alexander returned home earlier than expected. He found Isabella in the library, a rare place for her to be. She stood by the window, a leather-bound book in her hand, but her gaze was far away, lost in the horizon. She startled when she saw him, closing the book too quickly, as though he had caught her trespassing in a memory. "You like to read?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes fixed on her. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Books keep secrets better than people," she replied, her Italian accent weaving music into her words. From that moment, the seed was planted. Alexander told himself it was harmless, conversation here, a shared laugh there. But something burned in him, something restless and insistent, whenever he was near her. Isabella never encouraged him, but she never pushed him away either. She seemed to live in a world where boundaries were blurred, where silence said more than words. The stormy night of betrayal came almost without warning. Olivia had retired early, fatigued by another long day of pregnancy. Isabella had stayed late in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't need to be cleaned. Her fingers moving slower than usual. Alexander found her there, the storm pounding against the glass, shadows trembling in the candlelight. "You don't have to work so late," he said softly. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting both defiance and something vulnerable. "It helps me forget," she whispered. "Forget what?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But it did. To him, it mattered more than anything. He wanted to know her secrets, to unravel the quiet mystery that made her different from every other woman he had ever known. He stepped closer, and the world outside roared with thunder, as if warning him. His hand brushed hers, and she flinched, but did not pull away. The first kiss was not planned. It was desperate, stolen, forbidden. She tasted like wine and sorrow, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt alive. The days that followed blurred into a dangerous rhythm. Meetings in boardrooms by day, stolen glances and whispered words by night. Isabella never asked for promises, never demanded anything, but her presence consumed him. He became reckless, careless even, dismissing Olivia's concerns when she noticed his distance. He convinced himself that what he had with Isabella was destiny, not betrayal. When he finally filed for divorce, the scandal exploded like wildfire. His lawyers begged him to reconsider, his board threatened rebellion, and Olivia's family vowed revenge. But Alexander didn't care. He thought he was choosing love over duty, passion over pretense. He thought Isabella was simply the woman who had awakened him from a loveless life. But there were things he didn't know. He didn't know why Isabella sometimes stared out the window as though she were waiting for someone to arrive. He didn't know why she hid letters in a box beneath her bed, letters written in Italian, sealed with a crest he didn't recognize. He didn't know why she carried herself not like a servant, but like a woman born into privilege and tragedy. All he knew was that he had fallen into a storm greater than the one raging outside his window that night. A storm he had chosen willingly, blind to the cost. And somewhere, across the ocean, in the gilded halls of Milan, a dynasty stirred. A dynasty that had long buried its secrets, unaware that one of those secrets was now living in Manhattan, in the arms of a man foolish enough to think she was just a nanny. The storm was only beginning. The months that followed Alexander Reed's decision were like walking a tightrope above a canyon. On the surface, his life glittered as it always had, limousines waiting at curbsides, boardrooms filled with sharp suits and sharper tongues, galas where the champagne flowed like rivers. But underneath, every step shook with instability. The tabloids feasted on the scandal. Billionaire CEO abandons pregnant wife for nanny, splashed across glossy covers. Investors whispered, old friends avoided his gaze. Yet, despite the storm, Alexander convinced himself he was untouchable. After all, he had Isabella. She was unlike any woman he had known. Olivia, with all her elegance and sophistication, had always seemed carefully curated, like a jewel polished for display. Isabella was raw, unpredictable, and haunting. She would move through his penthouse with silent grace, sometimes humming Italian lullabies, sometimes disappearing into her room for hours, leaving him restless and desperate for her presence. At times, he caught her staring out the window at the sprawling city, her expression unreadable, as if New York were not her world but a prison. One evening, as the city glowed under a velvet sky, Alexander invited her to join him at dinner in a restaurant only billionaires could book without a year's wait. The maitre d', nearly, tripped over himself escorting them to a private corner, and every pair of eyes in the room followed the mysterious woman at Alexander's side. Isabella wore a simple black dress, her hair loose, her skin glowing under the warm lights. She looked nothing like a servant. She looked like a queen stripped of her throne. But Isabella was uncomfortable. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes scanning the room with subtle caution. She drank little, spoke even less. You don't like this kind of place? Alexander asked, leaning toward her, trying to capture her gaze. She smiled faintly. I like it too much, she murmured. And that makes it dangerous. He frowned, puzzled. Dangerous? What do you mean? But she shook her head, brushing the subject away like ash from her sleeve. It wasn't the last time Alexander felt her slipping through his fingers. He began to notice patterns. Late-night phone calls in rapid Italian, which she would quickly end when he entered the room. A small stack of letters she never allowed him to see, always hidden in the same locked drawer. Once, he caught a glimpse of one, a creamy envelope stamped with a golden crest, a shield wrapped in vines. When he asked about it, she snapped the drawer shut and whispered, some doors should stay closed. Alexander was not a man used to mystery. In his world, everything had a price, and every secret had a key. Yet Isabella eluded him, and that only made his desire burn brighter. He convinced himself she trusted him, even when her eyes said otherwise. He convinced himself she loved him, even when her silences told him she was somewhere far away. The turning point came when his company, Reed Global, received an invitation to a gala in Milan. It was one of the grandest gatherings of the European elite, a convergence of royalty, tycoons, and dynasties who had ruled industries for centuries. The Belanti fashion house was sponsoring it, unveiling their latest collection in a palace once owned by dukes. Alexander knew the board would resist him bringing Isabella. She was still branded, the nanny, by the media, a stain on his reputation. But he didn't care. He was determined to present her as his partner, the woman he had chosen against the world's opinion. When the night of the gala arrived, Milan was a city draped in gold. Chandeliers spilled light across the palace hall, strings of violins floated through the air, and women shimmered in gowns worth more than skyscrapers. Alexander, in his tailored tuxedo, exuded control and confidence. But it was Isabella who stole the room. She stepped beside him in a gown of black silk that clung to her form like liquid night, her shoulders bare, her hair cascading down in waves. A necklace of emeralds rested against her collarbone, catching the candlelight. The moment she entered, the crowd went still. Conversations halted, eyes widened, the music seemed to falter as if the orchestra itself had gasped. Alexander, though proud, was bewildered. He had expected whispers about his scandal, mocking looks at his choice of partner. Instead, he felt something else, recognition. People were staring at Isabella not as a mistress, but as though she were a ghost from their past. An elderly woman, regal and sharp-eyed, approached with deliberate steps. She wore a crimson gown heavy with jewels, her silver hair swept into a crown-like style. The crowd parted for her as they would for royalty. Alexander knew who she was instantly: Contessa Marcella Bellanti, matriarch of the fashion empire that ruled Europe like an unelected monarchy. The Contessa stopped in front of Isabella, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Mio Dio," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's returned." The words sliced through the hall like a blade. Murmurs erupted. "Who is she?" someone asked. "It cannot be." Another voice hissed. "But she vanished, the daughter." Alexander's confusion deepened, but Isabella stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed fear. For the first time since he had known her, she looked cornered. "Isabella," the Contessa said, louder now, her voice echoing through the palace. "Your blood cannot be denied." The room gasped as the truth rippled through it. Isabella was not just a woman who had wandered into Alexander's life. She was the hidden child of the Bellanti dynasty, the secret daughter they had buried in silence decades ago. A child born of scandal, cast away to protect an empire's reputation. Alexander's chest tightened. He felt as though the floor had dropped beneath him. The whispers grew louder, circling him like vultures. "She's a Bellanti, the lost heiress. Impossible. Why would she?" He turned to Isabella, desperate for answers. But she met his gaze with something colder than denial. "I told you some doors should stay closed," she whispered. The rest of the night unfolded in chaos. The Bellantis closed around Isabella like a wall of velvet and silk, whispering urgently in Italian, reaching for her hands as though she were a treasure long lost. Alexander was pushed aside, an intruder at his own table. Reporters had already caught wind of the scandal, cameras flashing, headlines being written before the gala even ended. By the time he managed to reach Isabella again, she was pale, her hands trembling, her gown clinging to her like armor. "You knew," he demanded under his breath. All this time, her eyes glistened, not with guilt, but with something darker. "I knew who I was. I didn't know they would recognize me. I thought I had escaped." "Escaped what?" he pressed. She shook her head. "You don't understand, Alexander. The Bellantis are not just a family. They are a kingdom, and kingdoms don't let their blood run free without reason." The night ended with the world watching, every camera fixed on Isabella, every headline proclaiming her return. Alexander, once the center of attention, was suddenly reduced to a footnote in the unfolding saga. He had thought he was scandalous, daring, reckless. But he realized he was nothing compared to the storm Isabella had carried with her. Back at the hotel, silence weighed heavier than words. Isabella sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. "They will not stop now," she whispered. "They will want me back. They will claim me. And you," she looked at him, her expression almost pitying. "You don't know what you've dragged yourself into." Alexander, for the first time in years, felt powerless. The empire he had built with steel and numbers seemed fragile compared to the empire of blood and silk that had just risen around Isabella. He had thought he was rescuing a woman from servitude, but in truth, he had awakened a queen from exile. And as the rain began to fall again over Milan, he realized the life he had chosen was not merely scandalous, it was dangerous.